their certification, or our paraprofessionals to get their degree. Many of those folks are from Holyoke, from the community, and want to give back to the schools. We will continue our work with the secondary redesign, which I've shared with the council in the past. We still are maintaining our fuller school day. This budget does maintain current class sizes. We're not changing class sizes. While we may have fewer teachers in the budget, it's because our enrollment has declined, but it's not because we're changing class size. We made a commitment to keep the same class sizes that we have this year. So that just gives you a sense of what we're investing, and what are new investments, and what we're continuing to invest in as a school system. When we got our numbers this year, we were it was concerning to see that we again had a gap in terms of our and what we needed to reduce given our increased expenditures, and then unfortunately we didn't get the increases we wanted in the state allocation. So I want Anthony to talk a little bit about how we got this budget to a place where it's balanced in our proposal to the city.
Thank you, Steve. So the slide that we should be looking at is the one that says addressing the budget gap. So this was as Steve alluded to, as Dr. Zreich alluded to, this was a very challenging year. One of the biggest challenges that we had is that our net school spending amount is relatively flat. We've only received an increase of about 0.3% in net school spending, partially due to the inflation factor that the state used and a loss of about 16 students in the foundation enrollment. We also lost almost $1 million in charter reimbursement, which contributed to our revenue being relatively flat. And this past year, we also had about $1.3 million in carryover that we were able to use to help balance the budget. As we move forward, we didn't build in any anticipated carryover, so that contributed to the loss in revenue. Aside from revenue, we expected, if all remained the same, we expected expenses to go up by 6.8% or $6.2 million. The majority of that was an increase in salaries for teachers, and then healthcare costs. Healthcare costs continue to be a burden on the district. As those costs go up and revenues flat, it forces us to make some very difficult decisions and reallocate the available funding to meet the needs of the district.
Point of information, Joe.
Councilor Grady.
Just a point of information. The budget gap, schools per pupil allocation were reduced to $250 per student from $18.89, and the new amounts are roughly $16.39. Do you have the figures for the charter school student allocation?
The charter schools, we get an assessment from the state that says this is how much you have to budget. It doesn't give you a per student amount, but we did.
Why is that?
Why is that? It's just the way that they don't tell us this is how much per student. They just give us an assessment amount, which happens to be about 11.4 million. But what they do is they run those charter school students through the same formula that we get funded. So on average, the general fund budget is a little over $12,000 per student is what we get. So if it's technically what the charter schools are getting on average, but it varies. You get more for economically disadvantaged students. You get, if you have a higher population and special needs, there's a little increment above the baseline that you do get. So if their demographics don't mirror ours, they might not be getting the same amount per student that we are.
I was just looking for a rough figure.
Roughly 12,500.
All set?
Yep.
So the next page, it has yellow highlights. It's a projected budget for FY18. Our budget is phased into basically three phases. So the first step is before the governor's budget is released, or when the governor's budget is released, we update our revenue assumptions and we create high-level projections to let Dr. Reich know how much we think, moving forward, what our deficit is. And then we roll out the budget development process, and since we're so fiscally dependent on the state, every time the state budget moves forward, we update our assumptions. And in other communities, the state budget doesn't necessarily impact the school department's budget as much, but in a community like Holyoke, things that happen at the state level really impact us. So we have a very close eye on, 87% of the budget comes from state funding. So if anything happens at the state level, we have a really close eye on that, and we regularly update the receiver and on what those impacts are.
Quickly, has the special education gap reduced by any chance? The state reimbursement for special ed?
It's remained constant.
So they're still way out of
Excuse me?
left field compared to what they should be paying for special ed?
Yeah, they make an assumption that 3.75% of our population is special needs, and that 3.75%, they're assuming that out of the total, a certain percentage of their day is actually spent on receiving special ed services. So I think one of the reasons they do that is to, they don't want to add an incentive to label a student as sped. If they went dollar for dollar, you have this many sped students. Some districts, if you're getting more money for your special needs students, some districts may have a perverse incentive to label their students as special needs because it would come with more funding. So that's part of the reason in the Chapter 70 formula that they just say all districts, we're going to take your total enrollment, divide and multiply it by 3.75%. And based on that enrollment, you're going to get X amount for special needs students. Unfortunately, in a community like Holyoke, where we're at around 24%, it really does put a burden on the budget. We do get some circuit breaker reimbursement, and the state level funded that account. That circuit breaker reimbursement is about 72%. Right. So for any student that we spend 4 times the per pupil amount, so I think the threshold's around 48,000. So for any student one individual student that we spend around $48,000 or more on, we can apply for a circuit breaker reimbursement, the difference between that $48,000 and whatever we spend. We do have some students in residential placements that the tuition for those students are really high, but that's usually who it affects, the students that are placed out of district.
Thank you.
So I do want to clarify, because this could be confusing. The budget that everyone is reviewing in the city only reflects about $64 million. And the 2 pages back to back, one of them shows a budget of 90 million. I just want to explain, this 90 million, in my opinion, accurately reflects what the city is actually spending on education. The appropriation that is in the city's budget book does not include charter assessments. It doesn't include any of the fringe benefits. So I just wanted to point that out. This is an overall appropriation. This is what I think accurately reflects the budget. But the items that I highlighted all the way across in yellow, those items don't appear in the school department's budget. The next page shows how we get to the appropriation. We start with net school spending. We back off city admin costs that the city charges us. We add in charter reimbursement to get the adjusted net school spending amount. And then we add transportation, adult ed leases, and the cost to administer Medicaid claiming to get the total adjusted budget of about 90 million. But then to get to the city's appropriation, you have to back off the fringe benefits and back off the charter and choice numbers. And that's how you get to the number that's in the book. They're closely related, the two. I honestly think the 90 million paints a real picture of what it costs to educate our students in the city of Holyoke. But there is a difference between what you see in your budget book and what that total is. So as you noted on the the initial budget slide, we went into the budget year with a $5.7 million deficit. And this is, one of the things that we did was we looked at all funding sources available to the district. Many districts, when they go through the budget process, they're really just looking at the general fund because that's what the city council votes on, that's what the school committee votes on. But when we approach our budgeting, we look at all funding sources. We look at revolving accounts. We look at the turnaround grant. We look at Title I. And in many cases, we find some efficiencies or some strategic ways to fund certain things that would help us eliminate the $5.7 million budget gap that we were facing. All central office department heads were asked to submit a recommendation of 10% reductions and an impact statement on what those reductions mean for their department. We also adjusted our enrollment. There were some schools this current year, we estimated what the enrollment was going to be. As with every plan, as with every budget, as with every estimation, sometimes those numbers aren't accurate, but when we develop the budget this year, I think we have a much better picture of what our enrollment is going to be for next year. In doing so, we were able to realize some savings because there were some schools that were, we thought there were going to be a lot more students than there actually were. The schools per pupil allocation, so there's a portion of the budget, the budget process for schools works, they get a staff allocation based on the number of students that they get, and then we give them a per pupil dollar amount, and with that per pupil dollar amount, they can develop their own spending plan that's tailored to meet the needs of their students. That's what they use to purchase their counselors, their assistant principals, their clerks, their classroom supplies, their ILSs, things of that nature. So in order to reduce the budget gap, that was one area where we did have to cut. We cut $250 on average from the schools per pupil spending plans. We were able to review, initially when we developed the budget, we were thinking of like a 13% increase for healthcare costs, and through, as the budget process developed, we did adjust our major assumptions for healthcare and other benefits. And we also hired a consultant to come in and review our SPED department, and one of the focuses that they had was special ed transportation, and in doing so we were able to eliminate about $480,000 from what was being projected initially. The next slide talks about the major budget assumptions. So in building this budget, we're assuming, and this is a big assumption, that final state revenues are going to be equal to the House Ways and Means budget. So every number that you see in here on the revenue side, we're assuming that when the state finally passes their budget on June 30th or July 1, that those final numbers are consistent with the numbers that we see here in the House's budget. The other assumption we made is that the city is going to meet their net school spending requirement. That circuit breaker is going to be 72%, consistent with the current year. And we also assume that Title I will be level funded, and all E-rate applications will be approved. Another major assumption that we made was that enrollment is going to be consistent with the enrollment that we had this year. So if we get an influx of 300 or 400 students, our budget wouldn't be able to support that at this time. Utility rates, the major assumption that we have for that is that they're not going to increase based on estimates as of May, and that lost time is going to be $600,000. Does anybody have any questions up until now? Sure.
Councilor Grady?
Yeah, just quickly, I thought Dr. Zreck had mentioned that the enrollment had gone down, and that would definitely affect the Chapter 70 funds coming from the state. Once again, there's also an ugly rumor out there that the state hasn't got any money. So the assumptions that you're making are purely assumptions.
Mm-hmm.
not concrete figures. I just had a question on the budget overview. The city of Hoyoke, the local contribution is 10,380,000. The total budget is 12.81%, but your figures were the real budget is going to actually be about 90 million. So I would assume that other $9 million is going to come from the council allocations.
Yes, that additional revenue, it's not included in net school spending, not included on the slide that you're referring to. If you look at how the budget appropriation comes to be, it's that 81 that we discussed, but then you have to add in, above the net school spending requirement, you add in transportation, and any leases, because the state has very strict requirements. You know, out of the $81 million, they're giving us 87% of that, but they're very strict on what you can't use that for. So the difference in 9 million is, or I don't know if it's 9 million exactly, but the difference between the 90 and the 81 is transportation and leases.
Right, and so for this coming year, we do believe that what the proposal you have in front of you fully funds transportation. If you remember last year, I came and I said that I didn't believe, I said I'd have to come back because I didn't feel like transportation was fully funded. This proposal does fully fund transportation and represents a $130,000 reduction in the cost of the lease. Because as you remember, we've, per the challenge received here last year, we were able to consolidate to 2 floors, from 4 floors to 2 floors. So the lease amount is actually $130,000 less than the FY17 request for leases. So again, as I said when I opened, I feel like we're in a much better place coming to this conversation, particularly that I can say that this budget proposal does fully fund transportation. After we made some adjustments to our start and end times, as well as at least the lease payment is reduced. Halo is no longer part of our request. It's another conversation that we have had with the council, and so that represents the money above the 81 that you asked about.
Now, the transportation contract is being renegotiated this year. That contract is up.
It's up at the end of
So you hope to see a savings there with Durham, because there
Yep.
should be some room to move there, I would think, Doctor.
Absolutely, and so the contract ends at the end of the FY18, and we have a committee of there's counselors on it, there's school committee members that will be reviewing that, so to see if we can realize more savings from transportation. And we're hopeful. I mean, we can't make any promises, but I'm hopeful that we can be more efficient in our transportation costs moving forward.
And just one more quickly.
Sure.
The update on the new technology plans that you were
Right.
referring to, is there also something in the budget for the security for that technology? Because in today's age, with all the
Yep.
pirates that are out there,
Yep.
getting involved in technology, hopefully our kids, their records and everything are going to be secure.
I don't know, Anthony, you want to address that?
Yeah, we've experienced some tough times in October this year. We did experience a DDoS attack that crippled our network, but we were able to, over the course of a 3 to 4 week period, implement mitigation services. But we did a lot of work around network reliability and a lot of work around securing our network. In this upcoming budget, I think this upcoming budget definitely addresses some of the network reliability issues that we have. We're going to have a lot of work done over the summer on a lot of our servers, which causes a lot of the issues that we have been having as well. But yes, it does address, some of the recent attacks that we have had, and we do expect a more reliable network than what we've seen this year.
Thank you.
Councilor Lopez?
Anthony, can you help me out with transportation? How PVTA, the buses, all that, how that work?
So what do you mean, how does it work?
you have a lot of PVTA buses going to school. What is
Okay.
the amount of money that we're paying for PVTA buses? How are you making them accountable? All that information. How is the contract with the PVTA?
Okay, so PVTA provides transportation just to our high schools. They have a certain amount of stops and routes. We do run a bus pass program. So what we do at the beginning of the year is any of our high school students that live outside of 2 miles from where they're going to school, either Holyoke High or Dean, they get on this list called the bus pass list, and we give them bus passes so that they can hop on one of the PVTA routes to get them to either Holyoke High or Dean Tech. So that's the transportation that PVTA does. Van Pools does pretty much our McKinney-Vento homeless transportation, which is over $700,000. And then Durham pretty much does the rest. Durham does all of our regular special ed in-district transportation. Durham does our big bus transportation. We have about, I want to say 18 big buses on the road, 18 to 21. And we have about 33 mini buses on the road. And then some vans to serve some of our, smaller populations.
So let me ask you about PVTA. So you pay a flat fee for the PVTA, or how that work? How do you know how many students went from South Holyoke to Holyoke High?
So they start at, I want to say they start at 1,000 passes, and they bill us for this up front. And then at the end of the semester, they only bill us for the amount of passes that were in use. And oftentimes we get a credit from the initial appropriation. But we spend, I don't want to be misquoted, but this is something that was given to the finance subcommittee. We gave them information on transportation, and it had a lot of the questions it addressed a lot of the questions that you're asking.
Okay.
If you give me 1 second, I can find. So PVTA, we are projecting to spend around $345,000 this coming year, this current year. With Durham, we spend about $5.9 million. And then our homeless, for McKinney-Vento, that's around $760,000. And again, this was what I'm looking at was something that was provided to the finance subcommittee. We did have a discussion around transportation. I shared a lot of information. I'd be happy to share it with any city councilor who doesn't have it and is interested in reading through some of our transportation information.
Well, I do, and I just want to find out how other cities are doing this, and then see if you have any comparison between Chicopee, Springfield, and I will call you. I don't want to.
Interestingly enough, the first page of what I provided to the council gave a state average. So on average across the entire state since 2011, transportation has gone up around 26%, or on average 4.7% every year. Now, when you look at districts that have high special needs populations, which I consider to be more relevant to Holyoke, that increase has been about 42%, or on average, every year since 2011, it's going up about 7.5%. Holyoke, in comparison, is about 8.5%, because we do have pretty much the highest population of special needs students in the state. But my point in showing that is that we're not alone. The transportation costs are going up across the entire state, and especially in districts that have higher populations with students with disabilities.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Anthony, and thank you for explaining some of the intricacies of the budget here, with especially with the net school spending. On the talked about the rents, and I know Dr. Zweig talked about the less payment, and will be into the next coming year.
Correct.
Because I'm looking at what's said 172. I'm talking about the revenue. Adult ed and lease is 172.5, and then as of this year, it's 190. So we just got a little bit of an increase. Is that the revenue part?
So the reason that is because our initial ask was 320,000, and as you recall, the council decided to cut half of the, half of the appropriation, and then we had to come back to the council. So when Steve and I say that the lease expense is lower than our appropriation last year, it's not reflective of the cut that you guys implemented during the budget process. As you're aware, we had to come back to the council and seek to get that money to get us through the rest of the year while we planned on consolidating to 2 floors. We did put together a detailed presentation.
Right.
We hired architects to come in, and we provided the council with 8 options. But that's kind of, as far as where we go now, I don't know what the council's desire is in terms of exploring one of those 8 options. But one thing that was made perfectly clear to both Dr. Reich and I is that no matter what we do, we got to consolidate to 2 floors. So while the council's either decide, I don't know what the next steps are in terms of making a decision on a long-term solution. But in the short term, we are complying, and we do plan on consolidating to 2 floors.
Will that be effective in July?
Yeah, July 1st, first week of July.
Okay. And on your out-of-district, can you explain that a little bit, the charter schools and the out-of-district? Does that change much? Your students, go to other districts or schools. Does that number fluctuate?
It is a moving target because in a given year, it's tough to know how many. Some students come back from out of district, although that's not as typical as students leaving. We need to do a better job bringing kids back from out of district when we have programs that can serve them.
Right.
But it's impossible to know during the course of the year, so we have to budget carefully, so that we can accommodate if those moves happen where a student leaves us to go to an out-of-district placement. And those are very, pricey placements. And for some students, they definitely need it, and they deserve of that because we can't serve them in the Holyoke Public Schools. There are other cases, though, that we have to do a better job of bringing students back to the system because we in fact, can serve them. So that's something I think that's some work that we need to do moving forward.
Okay, that's good to hear. On your the out of district and some of the costs here, I know you can't control health insurance, retirements, benefits. Is there anything looked at with the health insurance to try to somehow cut costs there? I mean, is that every year the different plans they can get on? It's depending on what plan they get onto in the health insurance.
Every year, the city puts together a team, and they look at plan design. They negotiate with the unions. That work has been done. It was in conjunction with the mayor's chief of staff, the city solicitor, and in partnership with all of the unions. They came up with an agreement, and our overall increase in health insurance we're projecting to be 9%. Initially, that number was projected to be closer to 18% when we started this budget process. But as far as us doing anything to control it, we're just a department of the city. So whatever the city negotiates for health insurance is what the school department ends up getting.
Okay. And Doctor's right. The student enrollment, how much is it decreased for the next fiscal year? Approximately?
I think it's pretty flat in terms of the projections. In terms of the foundation is overall across the city decline, but in the Holyoke Public Schools, we actually are seeing pretty much a flattening of it for a couple different reasons. We now have preschool programs that we didn't have before that offer full-day preschool, so that's kind of mitigated against some of the choice and charter departure. And then we are seeing a lot of arrivals from Puerto Rico that have helped stabilize our enrollment. There's also the city is also capped now charter-wise. so they're at their charter ceiling. And so while students can leave for choice, the charter seats are capped for Holyoke. So we're pretty stable enrollment-wise, and if you look at what our estimated district enrollment is for 18, it's actually up 22 students from 2017.
Okay, thank you.
Gentlemen, thank you. I have to say it's been a learning year for all of us. Learning year in terms of a role that we've taken on that we never needed to in the past, and a role that I think we should have known. Some things should have been our role in understanding with the votes that we do have to take. Anthony, I just want to follow up in a couple of areas that relate to those. One is charter school spending. When you said the charter school funds, do you include the money that comes through the city that goes to the charter schools, and or the money that by formula is given back to the public schools?
Yeah, the way the charter school expenses work is that the district that the charter school belongs to, so if a student lives in Holyoke but he's attending either the Holyoke charter or he's attending Paulo Ferreira or he's attending another charter school in another community, we actually get funding for that student through the Chapter 70 formula, but then the state on a quarterly basis, they update, they look at enrollment and they say, okay, this student lives in Holyoke, but he's going to Holyoke Community Charter School, or he's going to Paulo Ferreira or another charter school. They give us the funding up front, and then they take it through, as part of their assessments on a quarterly basis. They basically withhold Chapter 70 money.
Okay. So when you're saying $90 million figure, the budget figure,
Yep.
the charter schools includes all of our students regardless of where they are in terms, the budget includes all of our students.
Correct. About 11.4 million of that 90 million goes to charter schools.
Okay. That makes sense, to reflect it that way, and I think we gives us a better understanding because we talk about it, but most of the time in more general terms. What we also learned was that dollar figure, although our auditors have been updating us, is in the cherry sheet reflection, and we get that, but it's never been in either budget. Okay. So it's been hard to pinpoint and to keep a finger on it. And also we've been told when the dust is settled, we've yet to get our full reimbursement by formula from the state, which is true. The other area, you talked about fringe benefits being part of the $90 million. Are you talking about health insurance, vacation
insurance,
time?
retirement? So our portion of the overall pension obligation, we do have about $3.8 million for retired teachers. Health insurance. So we, it's that plus the unemployment, plus Medicare, payroll taxes. All those figures are in the 90 million, but they don't appear in the 64 million that you see in our budget.
Correct. That part we didn't know. And although I don't think we ever had a great handle on the numbers, and this city has always struggled with health insurance, and I know we attempt to do the right thing, but I think we fall far short in what we provide our employees in terms of health insurance, and that goes across the board with all departments. So those are the two areas that make up the 90 million. There's one other area that isn't in the 90 million, which I would love for someone to come back and give me a figure on this. And I call it the teacher out-of-pocket expenses. Our teachers spend close to $200 to $300 a semester out of their pocket on their students. And that's before receivership. That's before anything. And that's a fact that I can tell you across the board, because when I do my taxes, my other half brings me all our receipts so I can make sure the IRS doesn't audit us after I say so much was spent. And the receipts far go beyond what the IRS gives you a credit for. But our teachers, and I think all teachers are like that, and I don't mean this in a cynical or a bad way, but in a way, to understand that their dollars are going back into the classroom, their operational needs and things. And I think that would be great if we ever had a figure and recognize teachers for doing that.
Can I just comment on
Sure.
that? I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, my better half also spends at least that much as a teacher, but I know our teachers contribute a tremendous amount to annually to their classrooms. And one of the things that when we do an annual survey that's actually public on our website of staff feedback, one of the areas that we have not scored well in is around resources. And to try to unpack what that means for teachers is important for us. And so we have to get better at that area as well. I think resources is partly the facilities, that they work in, but it's also, making sure they have access to the technology, the materials, the supplies that they need. And you're right, Mr. McGivern, our teachers go well above and beyond, particularly when our students, many of them can't bring a lot from home. I know our teachers go above and beyond to provide our kids with things that they need to be on an equal playing field in terms of materials in the classroom. So I appreciate you recognizing that.
The other area, the special ed population, the 24% figure in the state, the way it looks at, that to me is one of the biggest crux of everything that is happening in our schools. It has been for some time. And yet, and maybe we have to do a better job of communicating with our state delegation. Maybe it's just going to go on deaf ears down in Boston. But we and Anthony, did you say we have the highest special ed population of the state?
Very close to it. I can't imagine anybody being higher than 24%, but I can't go on record and say that that's a fact. But we have to be top 3 districts at least.
And the only additional help we get, and pardon me because I didn't write it down, but you said was the
circuit breaker
dollars.
And we do get an IDEA grant as well, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act grant. We do get a federal grant to help offset some of our special ed costs.
Because, across the board, that has an impact on everything from education to transportation to not just the budget, but, I'm sure our test scores are reflected by that high of a population. And there's got to be a way for the state to recognize, or understand better what's happening in a city like Holyoke.
Yeah, thank you for pointing that out. One thing that I will note is that last year in October, there was a foundation budget review committee that met for an entire year, and they realized that the Chapter 70 formula hasn't been changed since 1994. And since 1994, a lot of things have changed. They've taken the same formula and applied an inflation factor. Sometimes that inflation factor is 1%. Sometimes that inflation factor is negative. Last year it was negative 0.22%. But this foundation review committee, it consisted of superintendents, school business administrators, legal people, people from DESE, and they put together some recommendations and handed it to our legislators. And it's a pretty quick read if anyone's interested, but every single recommendation that they put forward would significantly help a district like Holyoke, because they're recommending more funding for Chapter 70. They're recommending more funding for special needs students, more funding for low-income students. Not every district would win with some of their recommendations, but Holyoke will definitely win. And if there's anything that we want to rally around, I would say that it would be implementing some of the recommendations that a lot of very intelligent people sat around and worked on for an entire year that address some of the deficiencies that are in the Chapter 70 formula.
Very much needed, in my opinion, very much needed. When we sat here with Jay Sullivan, the Assistant Director of Finance for Education, we talked a little bit about that. And one of the things I noted going back as far as him is since ed reform, not just as, things haven't changed to reflect how times have changed, but it doesn't address the formula, of what the population of a city like Holyoke is about. And there's about 4 or 5 of us, if you go Springfield and Lawrence and Lowell and so forth, and there's some more that are coming close and will be within this, what I'm about to say, category in the near future. But we didn't create poverty. We service poverty. We service poverty by availability of low-income housing, not all created, not all managed by the city, not all managed by the federal government, but in existence for, we could talk historically about why, it doesn't matter. It's in existence. And we do a fairly good job of servicing poverty. Many of us feel that the answer is to break the poverty cycles. Education is a big part of that. Education leading to jobs, leading to, and hopefully our students staying on as good Hoyokers and making that reflection of the poorest community in the Commonwealth go down. So when these formulas reflect, low-income students and special ed students, that's our neighbors across the river helping us pay for what they should be paying for. The entire state has a responsibility to deal with low-income special ed and to deal with what the needs are and the demands that are placed on communities like Holyoke. So I hope they recognize what the committee, the foundation budget.
It's a foundation budget review committee.
Yeah, I hope they recognize the message, and I'd be glad to make it even more louder in our end, but I think our voices have been heard, but hasn't done much good over the years.
Yeah, and I will say that the average community in the Commonwealth can spend 14% over net school spending, or does spend 14% over net school spending for its schools. But if you look at communities like Holyoke, gateway communities, the ability to do that it doesn't exist. And so for that reason, some of these communities right now are talking about challenging the state, through the courts even, because of that disparity that now exists, because it's hard for us to compete beyond the if we're, this is not to critique the city of Holyoke, because the ability to pay is the city's challenged. The ability to do what it needs to do across the city is challenged. So, but it does put us in a competitive disadvantage with some of the communities that can go above and beyond that net schools number.
Councilor Green.
Well, this is, sure it's budget related, but as you gentlemen plainly know, the reason that we're under receivership is because of student performance primarily. So I have filed an order with the City Council that we can get some test scores to see what improvements that our children have been making since the receivership took over, and to make a comparison dating back, because we're data driven, and that's what I hear all the time about being data driven, statewide, citywide. So I'd like to get some data on our student performance when you guys get a chance.
We can easily get you that for last year. We won't have results for this year until October, but we have that for last year for sure. We'll certainly do that.
Councilor Reagan?
Thank you. At the risk of asking you to repeat yourselves, we've been bouncing around a lot about how the city does or does not meet net school spending because of the various categories. And on your budget sheet, you've talked about health insurance and unemployment that's on the city side, and you have mentioned how, in at least one example, it's held on the school side, and that it had different implications for the budget. And I'm wondering if you can just run down through us how the city will meet the net school spending specifically within this budget. I know most of it's passed through, but to bring that into the discussion, because on the one hand, I understood it was handled differently, but on the other hand, I understood things like unemployment were part of net school spending. So I just want to make sure I have it clear.
Yeah, so unemployment and other benefits are, are line items that do count towards net school spending. But when we do, so a budget is just a budget.
Right.
When we actually want to figure out whether or not we spent according to net school spending, you have to wait till the year closes out, spend all the money. If you spent 100% to the budget that we're proposing right now, if we spent 100% to that, then we would meet net school spending.
Okay, because of how the allocations are laid out. So
Correct.
if it remains true, then we would meet it.
If it remains true and our budget is so perfect that we spend
Right.
every single penny that we get, then we would meet net school spending. There are things that are out of our control. For example, we estimated how much health insurance is going to be. If health insurance ends up being lower, then that affects our ability to meet net school spending. So if we budgeted $4 million in health insurance but only spend $3.5 million,
Right,
then we're short $500,000.
right. And
If
the
that was
other-
the only thing that was
And the other big variable we had was the transportation, which does not count toward net school
Yeah, it's a
spending. But
separate-
because we're so heavy on that, we end up spending it in totality. But when you come down to that specific analysis, it's not included.
correct. You go through a process, we have to conform with the state's accounting system. They have an end-of-year report that they require all school districts to file every year. It's due in October of every year. It's audited by external auditors. And part of the process is fitting every single expense that we have into the categories that they require.
Right.
When you get to transportation, it goes into one of those boxes, but when they're doing the calculation for net school spending, it's not even part of any number that they're using to calculate the net school spending amount.
Right. So I guess the point I wanted to make is whether the unemployment sits on the city side from a budget point of view or in the school. At the end of the day, the actuals will be what goes into
Correct.
determining whether we meet it or not.
Correct. It sits on the city's books, but when we finish, throughout the year and when we close out the year, when I go fill out the financial end of year report,
Pull it in.
I work with the auditor to agree to the numbers that are going into, those categories that I can't really see.
Yeah. And I just think for any of the public that may be listening, it begins to sound like if net school spending isn't met, that there's not resources from the city going to the schools. And so I think it's really good that we've had the discussion around the transportation and how significant it is, because it is a huge portion of the monies that are going in to support the schools, albeit not in that classic definition, if you will.
Right,
So-
and that's why this budget, I'm approaching this budget with more confidence because we're coming into it with what we believe is a fully funded transportation request.
Right.
Appropriation and what's budgeted, as opposed to this year where, we came in $800,000 short, and that's why we're asking for the transfer to occur. Because if we were to absorb that in our budget, then that any of those monies would not be subject to net school addressing net school spending, because it's going towards transportation.
Right. Thank you.
So,
Anthony?
okay. Should I continue, or do you guys have more questions?
Why don't you continue? I
Okay.
have some questions, but I want to play the devil's advocate about a vote we have to take next Tuesday and try to talk about next year, but what's important for this year.
Right.
Well, if we don't do it, it's going to hurt next year.
That's right. That's right.
Have an impact on next year.
So I think the slide we left off on was the budget overview. And there's a big coin that you see here. And I apologize to anybody who sat through the finance subcommittee the other day, because a lot of this information you had already seen. But this coin just demonstrates that out of the net school spending requirement, 12.9%, or $10.6 million, is coming from local Holyoke funding. The rest of it is coming from the state through the Chapter 70 formula. So, as I mentioned in my opening statements, we're very heavily reliant on the state budget process, and we monitor it closely. Other communities, You may wonder, why are they done with their budget in January? It's because they don't care what happens with the state budget. We need to wait to see what the governor is going to do before we can even begin the budget process. The next slide just shows us where we rank in terms of some of the lowest local contribution in the state towards net school spending. Holyoke sits right around third, with Lawrence leading the way, but you can see other communities like Lowell, Fall River, they fund above the net school, or a larger portion of their budget, sorry, I misspoke. A larger portion of their budget is funded by local taxes, not funded by the state's Chapter 70 formula. The next slide goes on to talk about net school spending and the net school spending requirement. Again, this is information that, I apologize, had already been presented to some of you. You have a 5-year trend there, and then the next two slides talks about where we were at in the last 5 years in relation to net school spending, where our actual net school spending. You could see in 2012 we fell a little short, and this past year we fell short. But in 2013, 14, and 15, we spent above the net school spending requirement. And then the next slide shows you other comparable districts and where they are in terms of funding and spending, either at, below, or above the minimum net school spending requirement. And we just gave the committee that as a point of reference. The next slide is it looks like a big dollar amount, or a big dollar. This is a budget by object, so it shows that, out of every single dollar that we spend, how much of it goes towards salaries and wages, how much of it goes to supplies and services, and then utilities and out-of-district tuition. Education is a very labor-intensive department, and oftentimes, when you talk about personnel costs, you include fringe benefits. And if we were to include fringe benefits into salaries and wages, the school department's budget spends about 74% of every dollar in salaries, wages, and benefits. The next slide is a budget by chief. As you could see, this was a pretty challenging year where every chief was asked to make a reduction, and by reducing the per pupil amount at the schools as well, we did have to make some reductions at the schools. All the departments, with the exception of operations and finance, had shown a decrease, and special ed as well. But I do want to point out that the majority of that increase was the increase in transportation for finance and operations, and then in special ed, the majority of that increase was some services that had previously shown up in the prior years at the schools, but since it's a budget item that is directly managed by the special ed department, that's just an accounting fix there. It's about $400,000. The next slide, we've been throwing out this $91 million budget, or this $90.3 million budget, but the reality is we do have about $19.5 million in grants, so our total budget is really closer to $110 million. And as far as last year compared to, or this year compared to what we're requesting for next year, that overall appropriation has gone down about $659,000. We did receive a private grant to help expand our dual language program to Ian White, and we're building this budget on the assumption that money is no longer going to be available for next year. Steve, if you want to close out with some final thoughts.
Yeah, just the final thoughts is, again, as I started at the beginning, the budget is aligned to what our values and priorities are. Even though we had to cut a substantial amount, we tried to stay true to what we've been trying to do as a system around a pathway for every child. We did extensive work to minimize the impact in the classroom. Unfortunately, schools did have to take in total $1.5 million cut in schools this year. But the majority over the last 2 years has been to the central office. The numbers have been close to $4 million in terms of centralized funds that we've been able to protect schools. We've also received, through the receivership, about $7 million in grants and targeted assistance, not just to the district, but to individual schools as well. So that's helped mitigate against even bigger cuts that you see around the state, other districts having to take. So while it's painful, we've been fortunate that we've had grant funding that has allowed us to, and that we've been able to trim from centralized expenses. Last year we cut 16 positions in the central office, which is allowing us to consolidate space. We do think that this budget is responsive to the feedback we've heard. There's a lot more we'd like to do, and if we had more resources, there's a lot more we need to do. But we did the best we could with the resources we had around our priorities. And I still think we have more work to do around efficiencies. In terms of, we're still creeping out of the 20th century in terms of our systems, both within the school department, but between the schools and the city. I think we've made a lot of gains this year in terms of automating systems, but we're not there yet, technology-wise. And we do think there's more savings to be realized over time in how our systems run as a school district. We do think special education, to the point that's been raised, is an area we have to dig in deeper to realize more savings. We do spend quite a bit. The needs are there, but I question whether we're being as efficient as possible in special education. So we do think we're coming to to close, I think we're coming to the council in a much better fiscal position than we were a year ago. We're confident with the budget, as much as I would like to have. If you want to throw another $5 million at us, we'll take it. But I'm not coming to you this year saying, I know I'll be back, like we had to say last year. So thank you, and if you have further questions.
Councilor Graney.
Just one quick one. Are we still outsourcing any of the consultation fees for special ed, like we used to, organizations like Futures, where we were giving them $30,000 a month just for a consultation fee? Do we still have those fees?
We do, but we've reduced those, but we do still have them, yes. We do use Futures. We're working hard. I mean, it's very hard to find school psychologists right now, and so even Futures has a hard time finding them as well. But we'd like to wean ourselves off of that, but the human capital isn't out there. So I would like to get rid of all those contracts, because you're right, it does. But we have to provide.
It eats away. It eats away.
It does eat away a lot, yeah. But we do still have those contracts. Yes.
Thank you.
I stated or alluded to what my next question is, but it's folded here. One is for next year. Doctor, you said some of your budget reduction efforts include a 10% cut, which I think you said department heads, or departments, in some other areas. Will that reflect in layoffs? That will reflect in the unemployment costs?
No, so I can talk a little bit about the layoffs this year. We're not laying off we had 16 positions reduced at the central office last year, going into FY17. I think we have one for this coming year. Where we see reduction in the central office is services and our expenses. That Anthony said, that 10% is about around expenses. The number of teachers who are being non-renewed are being laid off is actually less than a year ago at this time as well. Now, we can never predict who will be collecting and who won't, but the numbers are not as high that we project going into FY18 as they were going into FY17.
And teachers who could be eligible to collect, will be starting in September. Are we still making those efforts?
Any teacher that we want to return or substitute, we're making it clear that they have an assurance letter to return for the upcoming school year. yes.
We're still struggling with a couple of final transfers that have come to us at the city council level for this year. They deal with, one of them, the big one, is unemployment costs from charter school surplus dollars. It's on the table for a vote for next Tuesday. If, being a devil's advocate, just if that did fail, that's going to have an impact right current, immediately, but will that spill over into next year?
So, if I understand your question correctly, you're asking if we don't get the transfer to fund unemployment, will we meet net school spending for this year?
And transportation as
Yeah, well, I think transportation passed, I think.
There's three tabled, I think.
Three. They all
Free
think they're all-
table, the
yeah.
big one,
Three of them.
transportation passed though?
No.
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 Okay. There goes my memory. Yeah, Anthony, but more from a budget point of view, not just net school spending, but just from a budget, from your current budget and what's the impact and what's going to happen to fiscal 2018, possibly because of a lack of a transfer.
So with transportation, I mean, that one's a little difficult to answer. If there's excess money or surplus money within our budget and we use that surplus money to pay for transportation, that puts us at risk at not meeting net school spending. And then it's kind of kicking the can down the road where, hey, you didn't meet net school spending, you fell short 500, you got to give the money back to the schools. The other option, which, I don't know what option we want to go, is that we don't have money to pay for our bills for July or for June, to the tune of about $721,000. And then this is a bus company that is located in Holyoke. The majority of their staff, I would believe, lives in Holyoke. And I don't know I would imagine that if we're not able to pay for June's bills, that they would have a hard time making payroll and running their operation. I don't think they're prepared to not receive, the months of June's expenses from the Holyoke Public Schools.
Is there any other questions? Councilor Thomas.
Just a brief question. Thank you, Dr. Dreich and Anthony. And my question is sort of off the budget a little bit, is parent involvement and how that's working. I know I do get an email probably once a week. I think it's from Judy Taylor telling what's going on in the schools. And I think students that are ready for school and ready to learn, a lot of our students have difficulties probably at home in their environments. And I know you've been working on it a lot. Can you just expound on that a little bit, what's being done, and what's the cost of that? Does that come out of some kind of funding that the school is in their budget?
The parent engagement funding, yeah. So we do have a line item. That's one of our departments, is the Office of Family and Community Engagement. So we do have staff that at each school that work with families around attendance and then engagement. It's gonna. We're not where we need to be there. I mean, we're still building trust. I don't think a lot of our families trust the schools yet. There's skepticism still from the community, and I think that's work that we need to continue to do as a school system. We just got the results back of our family survey, which will be on our website in the next week or two. We're going to share it with the school committee next week. And while there are some areas of improvement, there's still areas of, families still, like I said, they're not trusting in some places. And we see some schools that are really doing an excellent job with their families, and then other places where the families don't feel like they're part of the process. And so we definitely have some work to do. I will say, if anybody there was a lot of engagement over the last 2 weeks around our start and end time release, and I don't know if you were following social media. I was getting a lot of emails and correspondence. So there was engagement there. And, I have to say, I see that as positive because that means that people do care and they are invested. And I think a lot of our families are when it involves their kids. So, but more work to do.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Anthony, let me just reword the question or rethink this question. But I don't want to speak for the entire city council, but one of the issues that came up at our last full city council meeting with these transfers was, and Councilor Jernane was one of the ones that I think I will try to put it in his words, concerns, is if we transfer these identified charter school reimbursement surplus dollars into transportation, into unemployment, are we, and this goes back to, I think, the way you've reflected the $90 million as opposed to the $62 million number here this year, are we increasing the budget, which will put a demand upon the schools, and I'm not doing a perfect job, Kevin, sorry, but put the demand upon the schools in terms of the bottom line of the budget itself, for future years? Or I'm starting to wonder that myself, because we're still trying to come to grips with charter school dollars because we've never dealt with them before, or are we just moving them around for fiscal 2017?
So for the charter assessment to unemployment, you're just moving one school department line item to another school department line item. For the request for transportation, you're restoring, when we came to the council, we knew that, based on the contract that we have, the number of buses that we have, and our student population, we knew that our budget was short by $800,000. So I guess to answer your question, an increase or adding money to transportation, that would indicate an increase, but it really just reflects, fully funding the transportation budget that we knew fell short going into the budget process.
That's understood by the entire city council.
Okay.
We make clear, both from the finance subcommittee and from the beginning of the budget hearings themselves, that the transportation costs were underfunded. Mm-hmm. We understand that. Our auditors shaking or listening intensely behind us, and Josh, I think you know where I'm getting, and we really need that to be answered for next Tuesday. And I guess, and I hate putting words in anyone's mouth, especially Kevin's, but are we making an additional appropriation to the budget? Not just from the city side to the schools, or are we just reshuffling monies that are already there?
So the majority of that is reshuffling money that's already there, with the exception of anything you're taking out of reserves or free cash.
Right.
I think the free cash we dealt with, but Councilor Bacon?
Yeah, I really think the issue was funding a structural deficit, and that by doing that particularly out of the free cash and out of monies that otherwise would have gone back into free cash, we're just sort of kicking the can down the road, and we're funding a structural deficit, which appears to remain in place in the same way in the next year's budget. That's the concern as I heard it.
So I don't think this addresses a structural deficit. This addresses an area, as Dr. Zreich alluded to. We're very confident that the appropriation that we're asking for fully funds transportation, and we're going to try really hard to live within that. We think it's we're not going into this budget year saying we need more money for transportation, or that the transportation budget is not whole. So as far as a structural deficit, I think that eliminates the transportation part. The other part, there was an area this year where we, quite frankly, overfunded because the state said you need to budget, I'm just going to give you a number, $12 million for charter assessments. And then the next time they updated it, the first quarter of the year, the second quarter of the year, they said, sorry, you don't need to budget $12 million, you only need to budget 11.3. And those aren't, that charter assessment is not in our budget, but that $700,000 had they told us it was 11.3 to begin with, that 700,000 would have been on our books. It wouldn't have been in the city's, in that appropriation or the cherry sheet for charter appropriation.
But if I can,
Go ahead.
I think what led to the question, though, was that it was on the city side, and then it came in as a transfer from the city side, and then the understanding came about that if it hadn't been transferred, then it would have remained in the city side. So I think that's where the question came from. That's all
We're
I'm
not asking the
trying
money-
to say.
The money, in both cases, in the case of unemployment and charter assessment, that's on the city side. So it's actually, none of the funding is going to the schools. It's just covering, in one case, there's a surplus, and then in another area, there's a deficit. And both those line items are part of the allocation for minimum net school spending, both unemployment and the charter assessment. So all it is taking, it actually doesn't come to the schools, it's all on the city side. So it's taking money, taking a surplus to cover where there's a deficit. That's it.
And I think the only difference, or the big difference,
Hear what I'm saying.
is we've never dealt or never known
I
if
see.
there's ever been a surplus of what was budgeted charter school
I see.
dollars that, became at the end of the year surplus. And I guess the real question is, do they go back to the city as free cash, or are they carried over if they're not spent? Or if they're spent like this, it's not a new appropriation, not an increased appropriation during the year, just the rededication of the dollars.
So
Right.
historically, if nothing was done with that surplus, I honestly would have to defer to your auditor as to what happens with that, because it wasn't in our books. We don't know
Right.
historically if there was a surplus, what would have happened to that money.
Yep.
What I do know is that, or what I could say is that in this same scenario, the only time it really comes into play for us is when we go fill out the end of year report and we do that calculation as to whether or not we met net school spending. That's $700,000 that we should have had access to. We should have been able to spend. We didn't spend it because it was it was overestimated based on what the state told us. I mean, they tell you at the beginning of the year, budget $12 million for charter assessments, and then the first quarter comes, they say that number's gone up or that number's gone down. I don't know what the city's process was for monitoring that in the past, but I do know that I'm committed to working with Josh, and I'm committed to working with anyone that the city council wishes to provide whatever level of comfort you guys need, that that we're working together closely and that we're monitoring things like that.
At our last budget hearing, Joshua said the same thing, and he's shaking his head back there. So we just deferred this all to him for next Tuesday. He's taking notes, so I know he's going to get us the correct answer. I think, Linda made a good point about, we always look at these structural deficits, and they're important. I know one of the pages in the overview, we got some future, financial projections. But I think in terms of a structural deficit, what you presented this evening is an effort to reduce that deficit. The reductions, by your 10% reductions, your cost reductions, you're looking at transportation, Anthony, and that's what I hope that's what the city council needs to hear, so we can balance this year's budget without having an impact on the city and without, hurting the schools, but going forward with the next year budget.
Yeah, I would just say that was the first part, and the second part was learning that if there had been an excess, and this was all theoretical because none of us ever knew anything about it, that it had stayed in the general fund. So I think that was the second part of the concern. So if we're putting it over here, then we don't have it for over there. And I mean, it's just a tight year all the way around. So I'm not saying what the answer should be, but I think those two things are what gave rise to the questions at council.
And I think I think the number one reason these are on the city side traditionally, health insurance benefits because it's better to negotiate as a whole. But I think these things are on the city side because we don't know these figures till the end of the year or, halfway through the year. Projected figures we know, but we really don't know what happened until after it happens. And it's like waiting for the governor, and the state to make up their mind. They can do a budget reduction anytime, they want. And they can, cut 9 months into a fiscal year. They can cut Chapter 70. They can cut state aid. They can do things that have a 5-time impact on a city, because it's so late in the year. Thank you. Any further? Thank you. Thank you. All set?
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Have a good night.
There's nothing else on the agenda. Motion to adjourn. All those in favor? Any opposed? So moved.